So I was rather surprised to be invited to share my practice in this series of talks, because my initial reaction was that I don't have a practice. I'm someone who uses learning as a way of leading, which means I enthusiastically share what I'm reading, what interesting connections I'm making, and how I'm revisiting ideas and practice in new learning or contexts. So it's around 1985, I'm about 10 years old. I head into the garden alone and enter a tarp covered structure behind the apple tree that I've made from the frame of my sister's Wendy house. I used to sit in it for what felt like hours to watch a pair of blue tits feeding chicks in a nest box that we'd put up. This was me cultivating a practice of observation and nature connection. Let's jump ahead to the early 90s. I'm doing my A-levels. I read sci-fi and popular science books that talk of patterns, interconnectedness, fractals, feedback loops, and self-organisation in complex systems. I didn't really understand much of it at the time, but now I can see that I was laying the foundations for a practice of systems thinking. It's 1994. I'm standing knee-deep in the water of a fast-flowing stream near a village in mid-Wales. I'm taking measurements for the design of a hydropower system as part of my engineering degree. My course is underpinned by E.F. Schumacher's thinking on the natural world, economics, and appropriate use of technology. I was developing a practice of design using locally available resources. So now it's 1999, and I'm working with community groups in Dudley on environmental projects. I get curious about something called community development that I come across on the internet. I go to events and training, and I read books like these. And over the next 10 years, I developed my community development practice, working with groups in Dudley. We're going to jump a decade now to 2010, and I've joined Twitter. Through this, I've discovered a really interesting work that shares projects started by people who connect resources and skills that already exist around them. The projects are practical and hands-on, and stories of the projects are shared in books like these. My learning about design using locally available resources comes flooding back. I start looking for people to connect with on social media, and I find ways to get involved in new things. I join a group of people to work on creating an impact hub in Birmingham. I meet poets, graphic designers, filmmakers, social entrepreneurs, and photographers. My world grows, and I start to draw on June Holly's work to develop a practice of network weaving. It's 2015. I take part in a global design jam in Birmingham. I deepen my design practice through this experience, and I get really curious about ways that my engineering degree has given me the foundations of some really useful design practices. I read more to develop my understanding of design and how that the ways that I think influence my practice. My evolving design practices are hugely benefiting from knowledge and learning that's shared openly through something called Creative Commons. And I start to get quite curious about what this is and what's shared through it, and actually the whole history of commoning. So I start to develop a practice with the people I work with of sharing the things that we develop together through our work using Creative Commons licenses. It's autumn 2016. Following some failures, I begin to feel I've got enough learning to bring together a team of people with different skills and knowledges to form a social lab that's now based on Dudley High Street. As a team, we develop lab practices described in books like these, such as seeing the bigger picture, cultivating connections, staying close to people, and staying nimble. One of the most challenging things in lab work is understanding how the networks and projects that emerge affect positive change in the shifting systems that they're part of. And as a lab team, we need to develop practices embedded in our daily work around completely new ways of evaluating what we do and how we think about strategy. So I've also read a fair bit about this. By summer 2017, I've been working at a pretty full-on pace for about 20 years, giving evenings, weekends, and all kinds of time to projects. This book that I bought on holiday in Cornwall changed everything. I started to create space in my day to be unplugged, off social media, and quiet. I began to practice slow, intentional living, and I revived my practice of observation that I developed watching those birds when I was 10. Slowing down opens up space for me to follow my curiosity in new directions. By spring 2018, I'd taken part in 2 introductory permaculture design courses. And what these did was start to encourage me to think like nature. And wonderfully, permaculture design seemed to integrate all of the practices I'd cultivated to this point. So I signed up to do an online qualification in it. And through this, I made a commitment to pay attention to the experiences and work of Black, Indigenous, and people of colour. I started to read Afrofuturism, revisiting my love of science fiction through a new lens. and I started to think twice before choosing to read books written by white heterosexual men. My permaculture design course includes an invitation to reimagine economic systems. As I start to explore this, Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, is published. For me, it's kind of like a follow-up to that Schumacher Small is Beautiful, and that I've been thirsty for since I did my degree. And I start to think more about regenerative economics in relation to my practices. By summer 2019, I finally get hold of a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'd wanted for some time. It's one of my favourite reads of the year, and I read it again this year as part of an online book club during lockdown. It adds all kinds of layers and meanings to my practices of observation and nature connection. And we're going to come up to date now to 2020. It's around May. Police brutality catalyses a wave of Black Lives Matter protests. COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting Black people due to systemic racism. My Twitter timeline and my podcast feed surge with the work of brilliant people writing about anti-racism. I start reading their books. I'm beginning now to work on a practice of anti-racism. Last month, I start to listen to a permaculture podcast that features Carol Sanford discussing a regenerative paradigm. And this reinforces my commitment to learn about regenerative design and practice it. So I'm continuing to integrate and deepen my practices across the board. And as I'm doing this, my consciousness is growing and the context of the work seems to be becoming more challenging. So for this presentation, I've mapped out my learning and growth over time in a spiral. So earliest time starting from the beginning. And what's great is I can see that over time, my work is and will be informed by even more practices as I learn from the people around me and integrate more understandings and practices into what I do. So I'd just like to leave you with a couple of questions. I seem to have shelves full of well-loved books that relate to my journey that I've shared in this presentation. And I wonder what artifacts you treasure that speak of your journey. And finally, how might you see the spirals of your learning and growth? So my email address is there and you can find out more about the work that I'm doing at the moment with a brilliant team at colabdudley.net. Thank you.